Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my retrospective boxing series. So as some of you know already, I've been planning to do my top 10 greatest heavyweight champions of all time list for quite a while, and that video is currently in production, though it's taking quite a bit of time to do since I've been kinda going back and forth with myself over it, and I feel like before I go ahead and finish that video, I want to do as much research as possible, and make sure that the list is somewhat definitive and conclusive in my mind. In short, I don't want to make that video without really thinking about it, and I don't want to second guess the placements after it's uploaded. So the video will be coming pretty soon, just not right now. For the time being, I figured I would go ahead and resurrect another video idea that I had years ago, and one that I've talked about doing on live streams before, and that's my personal favourite fights to watch, or more specifically, the fights that I personally find the most entertaining. So that's what we're going to be doing. Lately I've been watching a lot of old fights, some of which I watched live, others I just found on the internet, some of which were before my time, some of which were during my time, you get the picture. And I think I've come up with a list that I'm happy with. Before I go any further, I just want to point out that I do have a specific criteria for this list. First of all, obviously it has to be a fight that I personally enjoy watching, so my opinion, which is of course entirely subjective. Secondly, it has to be a fight that I've seen in full, so it can't be some old fight that I've only seen snippets. It has to be the whole thing, I have to have watched it start to finish. Also, for the purpose of this list, it has to be a fight that's competitive. Generally, I find fights more entertaining and memorable when they are competitive, since it just makes them more fun to watch and analyse, so there can't be any one-sided mismatches on this list. Fourthly, it has to be a world title fight. The reason I decided this is because I wanted each fight to be somewhat significant and of a certain level of quality. Otherwise, the entire list could just consist of low-level 4-round bum fights that I happen to really enjoy. For example, you could have fights like Andrew Hartley versus David Dumas, which I've watched many times because it's awesome. And yeah, obviously fights at that level, they don't really have a lot of skills on display. So I decided that a world title was a decent enough common denominator for each fight on the list to have. So as long as the fight is for a version of a world title, then it can be eligible for the list. I'll accept an interim title as long as the winner is elevated to full champion shortly after, and the full champion is inactive and on the verge of being stripped. The world title requirement also means that fights such as George Foreman vs Ron Lyle, Matthew Macklin vs Jamie Moore, Brandon Rios vs Mike Alvarado 1, and several others that were genuinely great fights won't be on the list because there was no world title on the line. Again, without that common denominator, this list could consist entirely of domestic fights. So yeah, that's my criteria for the list. And bear in mind too, I haven't seen every single fight in the history of boxing. You know, there's bound to be fights out there that would be on the list if I had happened to have seen them. So after you watch this video, leave me your list in the comment section and let me know if there are any fights that you think I would enjoy and that I would consider putting on the list if I see them. Let me know in the comment section. So yeah, here it is, my top 50 best and most entertaining world title fights in boxing history. Let's get started. Just making it on the list at number 50, we have Marco Antonio Barrera vs Erik Morales 3 for the WBC Super Featherweight title. So this is of course the third and final in a pretty epic trilogy between Barrera and Morales, which is of course one of the most famous rivalries in the history of the featherweight and super featherweight division. These guys absolutely despised each other, and every fight they had was a classic that was competitive till the end. The third fight wasn't quite as entertaining as the previous two, which is why it's not higher on the list, but it's still a great fight nonetheless, and yeah, it just makes it on. It was one of them fights that was back and forth all the way, with both guys being cagey when they needed to, but also laying it on the line when they figured out they couldn't get a technical advantage over the other. These two were just so evenly matched that every fight they had started out as a boxing match but basically descended into a brawl. Of course, I'll talk about the first two fights later in this video, a bit of foreshadowing there. Coming in at number 49, we have Marco Huck vs Denis Lebedev for the WBO Cruiserweight title. This is a fight that, while not a flat out war or anything like that, it's a fight that I've always had a bit of a soft spot for, since it was a pretty entertaining clash of styles. You had Lebedev, who was a more sophisticated boxer, a southpaw who had great balance and great boxing fundamentals, but also one-punch knockout power in both hands. And you had Huck, who was more of a hard man, a guy who tucks up behind a high guard, pushes forward and tries to maul you and club you on the inside with overhand shots. And I always found it impressive how Lebedev was able to completely neutralize Huck's offense and kind of tame him a bit, shutting down his offense and taking away his jab. But at the same time, Huck's pressure and the occasional big straight shot he landed made the fight competitive. I thought it was actually a very intriguing technical battle, and one that I really enjoyed watching. Officially, Huck won by a split decision, but I personally had Lebedev winning in a close fight, and a really enjoyable one. Coming in at number 48, we have Alexander Usyk vs Tyson Fury 1 for the undisputed heavyweight title. This is actually the most recent fight on the list, which took place last year. I feel like all the negativity and vitriol surrounding the build-up to this fight, and the feelings and emotions people have towards both guys, kind of overshadowed how great a fight it really was, because in my opinion it genuinely was a great fight, and one that was an incredibly competitive, high IQ fight between two ATG heavyweights who were playing chess with each other, and it's honestly a fight that fascinates me. I've rewatched it so many times since it happened, and I feel as if I notice new things about it every time I do. Seriously, if you're gonna rewatch this fight, put aside your emotions and your feelings for either guy, and just look at the little subtleties and the technicalities, and the high IQ stuff that's going on in that ring. It's a really fascinating fight to watch for a boxing purist. Coming in at number 47, we have Manny Pacquiao vs Miguel Cotto for the WBO welterweight title. Out of all the Pacquiao fights at welterweight, for some reason, I always really enjoyed watching this one the most. Probably because it was quite an interesting fight stylistically, and although it wasn't really that competitive, at least not compared to other fights on this list, which is why it's not higher, I still really enjoy rewatching it. The kind of tactics that Manny employed that night, giving Cotto 3 shots early on, and dragging him into a fight, walking him onto those uppercuts and really setting the pace. It was a very risky strategy given the size difference, however it actually paid off, and despite suffering a burst eardrum early in the fight, Pacquiao went to war with the bigger man, and absolutely wrecked him, dropped him multiple times, took him to war and stopped him in the final round, after a really good performance. I think it was one of his better performances, and Cotto, for the most part, actually did acquit himself quite well. He did win a couple of rounds in the early part of the fight, and he landed some decent shots of his own, and I just thought it was a really entertaining fight while it lasted, even though it wasn't as competitive as some of the fights on this list, as I mentioned. Coming in at number 46, we have Denis Lebedev vs Guillermo Jones for the WBA Cruiserweight title. This fight was an absolute massacre, and it can be hard to watch in spots. What's interesting about it to me is that Lebedev actually boxed really well, and won the majority of the rounds clearly, mostly just circling around Jones and hitting him with bombs all night. The problem is that early in the fight, Jones landed a series of jabs from long range that triggered a massive hematoma above Lebedev's eye, just one of them freak injuries that could happen in any fight. And as the fight went on, the swelling blew up like a balloon. It was actually quite horrifying, and it looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. Lebedev showed an incredible amount of heart to last as long as he did, and as I said before, he was actually winning the fight the whole way through. The eye injury just made it nearly impossible for him to make it the distance, and eventually he capitulated, being stopped by the ref. However, the result was later overturned when Jones failed multiple drug tests over the course of a year and was stripped of the title, which may explain why he was just walking through punches like they were nothing. Coming in at number 45, we have Mike McCallum vs James Toney 1 for the IBF middleweight title. I've talked about this fight on the channel before, and how much it fascinates me. It's one of them fights where every time I watch it, I feel as if I notice something different, or learn something new. I almost don't know what else to say about it that I haven't already said in the past, but I honestly thought McCallum won the fight personally, though it was officially scored a draw. Despite me thinking McCallum won, it's feasible that I can see why it was difficult to score. But whatever my opinion on it, it was a very entertaining fight to watch at very least. Coming in at number 44, we have Alexander Usyk versus Michael Hunter for the WBO Cruiserweight title. Another criminally underrated fight in the Cruiserweight division between two guys at the top of their game. I remember being really intrigued by this fight going in. If you guys remember my prediction video before it, I was the only person in the YTBC saying it could be a tough fight for Usyk. Usyk was considered the number one guy in the division, and Hunter was relatively unknown. But as I pointed out in my video, Hunter was vastly more experienced than his record suggested, since he'd been a long-time sparring partner for several top heavyweights, and also had an extensive amateur background. And the fight didn't disappoint. It was really entertaining, and it was more of a long-range boxing match, and a really competitive one early on. Usyk had to work really hard to get the win, and I really enjoy rewatching it from time to time. Coming in at number 43, we have Manny Pacquiao vs Timothy Bradley 2 for the WBO welterweight title. After the controversy of the first fight, Manny was eager to get his title back, and Bradley, who kinda got ridiculed for both his performance in the first fight where he just ran and spoiled all night, and the decision he got, which was undeserved to say the least. He went into the rematch with a chip on his shoulder and a point to prove, and unlike the first fight, it turned out to be a really great fight. Bradley actually hurt Pacquiao a couple of times, and willingly slugged it out with him here and there, but once again Manny's superior hand speed and boxing skills made the difference, and he was able to get the better of Bradley, winning a close but clear unanimous decision, in a great fight that was much better than the first fight. Coming in at number 42 we have Roman Gonzalez vs Sisraket Sor Rungvisai 1 for the WBC Super Flyweight title. This was a pretty awesome action-packed fight where Chocolatito, who at the time was pound for pound number 1, ended up losing in a highly controversial majority decision to the relatively unknown Rungvisai, who went in there and mauled him, dropping him early in the fight and giving him the toughest fight of his career up until that point. Despite how hard the fight was, I actually thought Chocolatito won clearly. He landed many more punches throughout the fight and even styled on Rungvisai at times. Rungvisai was tough and determined, he gave it his all and made it a great fight, but I don't think the right guy got the decision, but it was a great fight nonetheless. Coming in at number 41 we have Arthur Abraham vs Edison Miranda 1 for the IBF middleweight title. This is another fight that quickly descended into an absolute massacre. Like the Lebedev-Jones fight, it's actually hard to watch at times, since Abraham, despite getting off to a great start, suffered a horrendous broken jaw in the third round and was very nearly stopped. It was actually one of the worst injuries I've ever seen in a prize fight, and to this day I cannot believe they didn't stop the fight. Nonetheless, Abraham continued to fight, and he fought 9 rounds with a badly broken jaw against Miranda, who at that point was one of the hardest punchers pound for pound in boxing, and Abraham's defense, durability and boxing fundamentals, as well as a few point deductions from Miranda, who was fouling non-stop, saw him through to a clear unanimous decision win. Coming in at number 40 we have Krzysztof Wlodarczyk vs Steve Cunningham 1 for the IBF Cruiserweight title. This is another fight that, while not an all-out war or anything like that, was a very interesting one to watch stylistically. You had Cunningham on the back foot, moving laterally and trying to box from long range, and Wlodarczyk coming forward all night, cutting off the ring skillfully and working on the inside, throwing punches with Cunningham and sneaking them through his guard. I thought it was a very good performance from Wlodarczyk, who seemed to completely shut down Cunningham's offense all night, and despite only winning by a split decision, I actually thought he won very clearly. Though Cunningham certainly had his moments and made the fight competitive, it's the classic boxer versus fighter matchup. Coming in at number 39 we have Denis Lebedev vs Murat Gassiev for the IBF Cruiserweight title. So this is another back and forth war in the Cruiserweight division. Yeah, expect to see many more Cruiserweight fights on this list, by the way. This fight was a particularly interesting one, since you had Lebedev, who I mentioned earlier, was the more classy boxer of the two, employing lateral movement and a decent jab, and trying to outbox and outwit Gassiev, who similarly to Marco Huck is more of a physical fighter, more of a pressure fighter. Gassiev, however, is a little bit more sophisticated than Huck, and that's why in my opinion he was able to give Lebedev a lot more problems than Huck was. He was able to drop Lebedev in round 5 with a body punch and pushed him all the way. However, I thought that Lebedev's performance from a technical point of view was actually better than the one in the Hook fight, and he actually landed many more punches on Gassiev than he was able to land on Hook, and actually started to bust him up a bit as the fight went on, so he came back well from the knockdown, and I just thought it was a very interesting and very entertaining tactical fight. I actually thought Lebedev did enough to win, but he didn't get the win officially, losing by split decision. Very, very underrated fight. I'd recommend you check it out. Coming in at number 38, we have Andrew Golota versus Riddick Bowe 1 for the WBC heavyweight title. I'm sure I don't need to tell you guys much about this fight. It was an absolutely brutal heavyweight slugfest. Probably one of the most entertaining heavyweight fights in terms of just sheer brutality. Golota was the slightly better boxer of the two, winning most of the rounds clearly. But every time it looked like he was in control, Bowe would come back and land something, turning the fight around. Golota would likely have went on to win, but he ended up getting himself DQ'd for low blows, since he just couldn't control himself. So yeah, a very dramatic heavyweight slugfest. Coming in at number 37, we have Tavoris Cloud versus Glenn Johnson for the IBF light heavyweight title. This was essentially a phone booth fight, two guys coming forward all night, both applying relentless pressure, and neither one wanting to give up an inch. One of them fights that was kind of exhausting to watch, just due to how much effort both guys put in the whole way. Ultimately, Cloud was the younger, fresher, stronger and fitter of the two. He was able to prevail, just slightly getting the better of Johnson in a great fight, one that I'd really recommend. I think it's underrated. Coming in at number 36, we have Naoya Inoue versus Nonito Donaire for the IBF and WBA bantamweight titles. This was the classic young hungry lion versus old crafty veteran type of matchup. You had Inoue, who was young, fresh, in his prime, and had one of the hardest punches pound for pound in boxing at the time, and Nonito, who was a pound for pound talent at one point, but had had many setbacks, and was at that point in time having a bit of an Indian summer in his career, having some very, very good performances and winning a few high-level fights. He was able to use that experience and ring craft to take the younger guy, who had never been 12 rounds before, into deep waters for the first time in his career, and really test his chin, stamina and heart, and it made for a truly great fight and a modern classic. Despite ending up with a broken orbital bone, and having to survive a scare late on, Inoue persisted and managed to fight his way to victory. Coming in at number 35, we have Jorge Linares versus Kevin Mitchell for the WBC lightweight title. In a way, this was actually quite similar to Lebedev versus Jones, but way more exciting in my opinion. Kevin Mitchell, as I've talked about in the past, is widely regarded as the best British fighter never to win a world title. And it's clear to see why. The guy had a lot of talent. The closest he ever got to becoming world champion was his fantastic fight with Linares, where he got off to a great start, schooling Linares, putting him down and looking well on his way to winning. Unfortunately, he sustained a nasty injury to his eye early in the fight from a clash of heads that was exacerbated by punches, leading to an incredible come-from-behind victory for Linares in a great and underrated fight. Coming in at number 34, we have Riddick Bowe versus Andrew Golota 2 for the WBC heavyweight title. Just like the first fight I mentioned earlier, the rematch was an incredible heavyweight slugfest between two very talented, yet very flawed heavyweights, and in my opinion the second fight, if you could believe it, was even better than the first fight. But it was basically the exact same fight all over again, with the exact same result, but yet it lasted a little bit longer this time and was a little bit more competitive. Coming in at number 33, we have Nigel Benn versus Chris Eubank 1 for the WBO middleweight title. Another classic fight here, and one that was a fantastic brawl while it lasted. Benn versus Eubank is of course one of the most famous rivalries in boxing history, with two guys who absolutely despised one another, and they had two pretty good fights together, with the first one being an absolute classic. Eubank in the first fight showed so much heart and desire to win, getting up off the canvas and coming from behind to score a spectacular stoppage victory in the 9th, in what was an incredible fight while it lasted. Coming in at number 32, we have Thomas Adamek versus Paul Briggs 1 for the WBC light heavyweight title. I talked about this fight quite a bit when I did my career review for Adamek, link in description, and I talked about how interesting this fight was to watch. It's one of those fights where Adamek was certainly the better boxer of the two, controlling the fight from long range and landing some massive punches. But he had his vulnerabilities in the fight due to the massive weight cut, and Paul Briggs was the kind of well-conditioned tough guy with the right attitude to potentially exploit that, and he almost did, landing a few shots of his own, backing Adamek up most of the fight, giving him an absolute war. I'd seriously recommend checking out the rivalry between Adamek and Briggs, because they made for some great stylistic fights, and both of them were fantastic. Coming in at number 31, we have Marco Antonio Barrera versus Erik Morales 2 for the WBC featherweight title. So just like the third fight I mentioned earlier, Barrera Morales 2 was highly competitive. It was a back and forth fight between two of the best fighters in the sport pound for pound at the time. And it was also a very difficult fight to score. What fascinates me about the fight in particular is that both guys made so many adjustments constantly, and the first half of the fight was actually pretty tame, particularly when compared to the first fight, since neither one of them really wanted to commit to their attacks after the insane 12-round brawl they had before. Morales would just try to keep the fight at long range, and Barrera would manage to drag him into a fight. At times Barrera would try to fight on the move, pumping a jab out there, throwing the straight to the body and allowing Morales to take the lead. And you could tell that there was just so much going on in the heads of both guys. However, in the second half of the fight, when it became clear that neither guy could establish any sort of technical superiority over the other, they ended up going to war again, and it turned out to be another great competitive 12-round fight. Not quite as entertaining as the first fight, believe me, we'll get to that. But yeah, a great fight nonetheless. Coming in at number 30, we have Daniel Geale versus Darren Barker for the IBF middleweight title. This was a fight that took everyone by surprise when it happened, since Geale was generally considered a level above Barker, and if truth be told, he genuinely was prior to the fight. It's easy to forget now, but at that point in time, Geale was considered one of the top 3 guys at middleweight, and was coming off a string of career-best performances, and Barker, who was a guy who had dominated at British level, yet when he tried to step up to world level previously, he failed miserably. Going into the Geale fight, however, he took the attitude that it was his last chance to be world champion, and he just wouldn't be denied. He fought the absolute fight of his life, put it all on the line, and left absolutely nothing in the ring. Despite Geale being the tougher guy, the better athlete and the better fighter in general, and despite dropping Barker early and almost taking him out, Barker got up, grit his teeth, and just went to war, throwing everything he had at Geale, pushing through the pain, and taking the fight by the scruff of the neck, taking over, and ultimately winning the fight on points. It was actually a pretty inspiring comeback at the time, and one that doesn't really get talked about much nowadays. Underrated fight in my opinion. Coming in at number 29, we have Victor Ortiz versus Andre Berto 1 for the WBC welterweight title. This is another fight that took everyone by surprise when it happened, and was considered an absolute classic, yet seemed to get completely forgotten about shortly after. I think the main reason for this is that both guys basically fell apart after this fight, and never accomplished anything of note from that point on. Ortiz basically became a meme after the fight, and Berto became known as the quintessential cherry-picked opponent, but the fight itself was amazing, and considered for fight of the year at the time, as well as a massive upset. It was a fight where Berto was trying to keep it at long range, and walk the aggressive southpaw into right-hand counters, but Ortiz had the kind of energy and tenacity where he was able to get in there and make it his kind of fight. Every time Berto hurt him, Ortiz came back and hurt him even worse. Both guys hit the canvas twice, both guys had their moments, and it was a very competitive fight till the end, with Ortiz winning by a close but clear unanimous decision. Coming in at number 28, we have Scott Harrison versus Victor Polo for the WBO featherweight title. So I may be a bit biased, since Scott Harrison is a personal favourite fighter of mine, as well as a personal friend. But this fight has always kind of fascinated me from a stylistic point of view. You had Polo, who was a tall, rangy, slick boxer puncher, who had underrated power and threw a lot of punches from long range, utilising great lateral movement, and Harrison, who was more of a stationary, rudimentary fighter who applied steady pressure, and it made for a fantastic back and forth fight. It's also one of them fights where both guys took over in stages. Polo had some big rounds early in the fight, Harrison completely took over midway and put a beating on him, looking as if he was going to force a stoppage, only for Polo to come back solidly in the later rounds, Harrison finished the fight on top, dominating the last round, despite being cut and bruised up badly, showing a crazy amount of heart and will to win, managing to hold on to his title. The fight was officially scored a draw, but I actually thought Harrison won by a single point. But again, I might be biased, so take it or leave it. So he didn't get the win, but it was an incredible fight nonetheless and an amazing one to rewatch. Fascinating matchup. Coming in at number 27, we have Amir Khan vs Marcos Maidana for the WBA light welterweight title. This was actually a similar kind of matchup to Harrison vs Polo, where you had Khan, who was a tall, quick boxer puncher with kind of an amateur point scoring style, but underrated power and incredible hand and foot speed, facing Maidana, who was a shorter, more stocky and more rudimentary fighter, who was more of a puncher in style, and a guy who tended to load up on shots. He was also a very emotional fighter who used to fight with a lot of anger, and that made pretty much every fight involving him a blast to watch. But the Khan fight in particular was very entertaining due to the clash of styles. Khan battered Maidana in the opening round, schooling him from long range, dropping him hard in the first round with a body punch, and you wondered whether Khan could have forced an early stoppage. But Maidana managed to grit his teeth and weather the early storm, coming on strong late, and the longer the fight lasted, the more it suited him. He completely took over late and put an absolute beating on Khan, and I'm actually surprised Khan wasn't stopped in that fight, considering the vulnerabilities he'd shown before. It's a fight where both guys showed a lot of heart and a lot of desire to win, and I really enjoyed it. Coming in at number 26, we have Juan Manuel Marquez vs Juan Diaz for the WBO and IBO lightweight title. This was a fight where you had an elite counterpuncher taking on a very tough and very game, yet technically limited fighter, who tried to drag the counterpuncher into an all-out brawl, and almost succeeded. Diaz dropped Marquez heavily early in the fight, and tried to make him fight his fight, but ultimately Marquez, who was the technically superior fighter of the two, managed to grab the fight by the scruff of the neck and completely took over, giving Diaz a near career-ending beating, and taking him out brutally in the late rounds. Very interesting fight, and I'd recommend it. It ended in brutal fashion and was entertaining while it lasted. Coming in at number 25, we have Marco Huck vs Firat Arslan for the WBO Cruiserweight title. Come to think of it, this list could honestly consist of Marco Huck fights, since this guy all through his career had some absolute bangers. So yeah, expect to see his name several times on the list. He was one of these guys who was just always in a good fight, whoever he was in with. A particularly fan-friendly style. The first Arslan fight in particular is one of them fights where you had an opponent who was able to match Huck's tenacity for the entire fight. Arslan was hyper-aggressive, a very high-volume pressure fighter with a granite chin and incredible stamina, as well as a pretty underrated active high guard, and he was the aggressor against Huck. Walking him down, working him on the inside and trying to overwhelm him with pressure, Huck was able to pick his shots and definitely landed the cleaner, harder and more effective punches throughout, winning the fight by a close but clear unanimous decision. Kind of a quality over quantity situation. At the time, a lot of people called the fight a robbery. Me personally, I thought Huck won clearly in a competitive fight. Coming in at number 24, we have Marco Huck vs Krzysztof Glowacki. Yeah, another Huck fight. Once again for the WBO Cruiserweight title. So yeah, this was the fight that ultimately ended up ending Huck's long reign as Cruiserweight champion in brutal fashion, and the fight was an absolute war while it lasted. Glowacki was a southpaw puncher, and an absolute powerhouse who was great at controlling a fight from mid-range and setting you up for the left hand. He also had a devastating right hook that he was quite sneaky with, as well as a great chin and a lot of heart, and he was able to get off the canvas in the mid-rounds, coming from behind to score a spectacular knockout in the 11th, winning the title. I believe this fight was considered for Fight of the Year at the time, and it's clear to see why. Coming in at number 23, we have Johan Pablo Hernandez vs Firat Arslan for the IBF Cruiserweight title. So this is a criminally underrated cruiserweight fight, where you had an interesting clash of styles. Hernandez was one of these slick Cuban southpaws with an extensive amateur background. However, unlike a lot of these Cuban fighters, who tended to be freak athletes, relying on their reflexes and speed to win fights, Hernandez was never actually that good an athlete. He had pretty poor stamina, wasn't that fast and wasn't the biggest puncher. He also had a very suspect chin, but what he did have, in my opinion, was a very high boxing IQ, as well as a great understanding of how to win rounds, and how to utilise the southpaw stance in the best way. And the combination of his physical limitations and his skills always made his fights very interesting and entertaining to watch, and his fight with Arslan, who I mentioned earlier, was an absolute banger, and an underrated fight to watch. Coming in at number 22 we have Ruslan Provodnikov versus Mike Alvarado for the WBO light welterweight title. This is kind of an obvious pick for the list, since when this fight was announced, it was well understood that it really couldn't be anything other than a war. You got two guys here who were non-stop action fighters, two brawlers with heavy hands and not a lot of defense, but an incredible amount of heart and will to win. Also, Alvarado had shown in his previous fights with Brandon Rios, particularly the second one, that he could handle relentless pressure and fight off the back foot behind a jab when he needed to. But Provodnikov proved to be too much for him and put a career-best performance of his own on the table, breaking him down bit by bit and taking him out late on the fight. It was a really fun fight to watch while it lasted. Coming in at number 21 we have Felix Sturm versus Matthew Macklin for the WBA middleweight title. So this was another example of a classic boxer versus brawler matchup. You had Sturm, who was a more fundamentally sound, upright boxer with a great high guard and very good technique, and Macklin, who was more of an effort fighter, a come-forward face-first brawler with a lot of heart, great stamina and very high work rate, attempting to win fights purely on volume. And it made for a great fight. Macklin got off to a great start, battering Sturm with hooks and uppercuts to the body, keeping him behind the guard and attempting to swarm and overwhelm him. However, he was largely ineffective with his work, never really landing with full force due to generally having quite sloppy punching technique and not a lot of accuracy. Macklin's lack of defense cost him down the stretch, as Sturm completely took over the fight midway, dominating the second half, putting a beating on Macklin and finishing the fight strongly, winning by a close but clear split decision. Fair winner in my opinion. But despite losing, Macklin never gave up and kept fighting hard till the end. Great fight. Coming in at number 20 we have Mike Alvarado versus Brandon Rios 2 for the WBO light welterweight title. So this was a rematch of a Fight of the Year contender between Rios and Alvarado, which I believe was the previous year, a non-title fight that was an absolute banger. The rematch, which was for a world title, was actually better than the first, believe it or not. The first fight was a back and forth slugfest that in my opinion ended prematurely in round 8, with Alvarado being stopped on his feet by the ref. In the second fight, Alvarado made a few technical adjustments, utilising lateral movement and using his jab more, and despite getting hurt several times in the opening rounds, he was ultimately able to get Rios under control, winning most of the rounds with effective long-range boxing. At the same time though, he stood his ground when he needed to, and both men landed a lot of punches and a lot of really clean shots, making it a really entertaining 12-round fight. Rios as always showed an amazing chin and a lot of heart, and despite losing the fight he was in it the whole way through, giving it his all. A really entertaining fight to rewatch. Coming in at number 19 we have Sugar Ray Leonard versus Thomas Hearns for the WBC welterweight title. Here we have a classic fight that I believe was actually Fight of the Year in 1981, and it's clear why. Hearns, who was the taller fighter and the significantly harder puncher, was for the most part able to control the fight from long range, but Leonard was always in the fight and he never lost heart, and I think this is the fight where Leonard really showed that he was more than just a pretty boy boxer. He was a guy who could bite down on his gum shield and have a tear up when he needed to. He took the fight to the bigger man, walked through some absolute bombs, made several high IQ tactical adjustments, and came from behind, pulling off a spectacular knockout victory in the penultimate round of a 15-round fight. So needless to say, had it been 12 rounds, Hearns would have won, but Leonard did what he had to do and got the win in spectacular fashion. Coming in at number 18 we have Marco Huck versus Ola Afolabi 2 for the WBO cruiserweight title. So this was an interesting one for several reasons. It's a rematch that nobody really asked for, and nobody seemed to think that much of at the time, and the reason for this is that these guys had a fight a few years earlier, and the first fight really wasn't that competitive at all. Huck was able to comprehensively outbox Afolabi in the first fight, and that made it quite surprising when the rematch turned out to be an absolute banger. I think the main reason for this was that Hook was, as some of you will know, coming off of an absolute war with Alexander Povetkin up at heavyweight in his previous fight, and he moved back down to defend his cruiserweight title shortly after, so he may have been a bit underprepared for it. The fight was close and competitive, with Afolabi having his moments, and both guys landing some bombs. Though as competitive as it was, I think it was a clear win for Marco Huck. Officially the fight was scored a draw, which I think was a bit harsh, because Huck was the clear winner in my opinion. Nonetheless, it was a great fight. Coming in at number 17 we have Clinton Woods versus Glenn Johnson for the IBF light heavyweight title. Here we have another criminally underrated fight, this time in the light heavyweight division, between Woods and Johnson, who, as some of you will know, had a pretty interesting rivalry, fighting 3 times in total. And what's interesting to me is that the first 2 fights, while entertaining, in my opinion weren't really that competitive. I honestly thought Johnson won both pretty clearly. The third fight, however, was an absolute war the whole 12 rounds. Both men landed bombs and went back and forth the whole way. Woods went into the fight extremely determined to get his own back, since he was absolutely seething about the first 2 fights, and the beatings Johnson gave him, and he put absolutely everything on the line, and fought the absolute fight of his life, kinda like Barker did against Gill, and in my opinion, Woods actually won the fight fair and square. A lot of people at the time called it a robbery, but me personally, I disagree. I think Woods landed the more significant shots and finished the round stronger. It was a close fight, but in my opinion, the right man got the win, and it was a truly great fight, and very underrated in my opinion. I'd recommend you go and watch it. Coming in at number 16, we have Arthur Abraham versus Robert Stieglitz 3 for the WBO super middleweight title. Speaking of underrated rivalries in boxing, here we have an absolutely amazing one between Abraham and Stieglitz. These guys seem to absolutely despise each other on a personal level, since despite being relatively classy, textbook boxers when they wanted to be, every single time they were in the ring together, they just wanted to set about each other, and every fight they had together was an absolute brawl, with both men getting the better of each other in spots. The third fight in particular was brutal, with neither man wanting to concede an inch, beating the brakes off of each other. Interestingly, Stieglitz, who in my opinion won the first fight, and didn't get the decision, we'll get to that later, and won the second fight by stoppage, was actually leading on the scorecards going into round 12, and would have won it if he'd have just stayed on his feet. However, he really was determined to get another stoppage, since he was able to do so before, and he went all out in the 12th round, battering Abraham, before walking onto a shot and getting dropped. The 12th round knockdown actually cost Stieglitz the win, with Abraham winning by a split decision, with I believe the knockdown actually being the difference on the scorecards. Very fascinating fight, I'd recommend you watch it. Coming in at number 15 we have Felix Sturm versus Daniel Gill for the WBA and IBF middleweight titles. This was a fight that was generally considered 50-50 going in, and it certainly didn't disappoint. It was another example of what I would call a high IQ brawl between 2 genuinely world-class fighters, with contrasting styles. Sometimes when you get 2 fighters who have a lot of skills, but are evenly matched in terms of ability, you get a fight that just descends into a scrap, and that's definitely what happened here. Both guys went back and forth all night, both landed a lot of punches, and neither was able to take control, making it a very, very hard fight to score, and a fascinating one to study. I think it's also a fight that took a lot out of both guys, kinda like the Berto Ortiz fight, because neither guy was really able to get back to that level again, showing significant signs of decline as their careers went on. Don't get me wrong, they had some good performances afterwards, but never at the same level. Officially, Gill won the fight by a close split decision, which was a fair result in my opinion, though I wouldn't argue either way, because it was a very close fight, and a very difficult one to score and a fascinating one to watch. Coming in at number 14 we have Thomas Adamek versus Paul Briggs 2, once again for the WBC light heavyweight title. This fight was in many ways just like the first fight. Once again Adamek controlled it for the most part, landing the better quality punches from long range and hurting Briggs several times. However, Briggs once again kept pushing forward, landing plenty of shots of his own, and giving Adamek all he could handle. Unlike the first one, however, Briggs managed to score a knockdown this time, dropping Adamek heavily in the first round, and getting off to a good start. Adamek also had a point deducted late in the fight which seemed to even up the scores a bit, making the fight closer, with Adamek once again winning by majority decision in another great fight, an even better one than the first fight in my opinion. I'd recommend watching both because they really are underrated. Coming in at number 13 we have Nigel Benn vs Gerald McClellan for the WBC super middleweight title. This is going to be a controversial one since most people seem to hate this fight, most likely because of what happened in the aftermath of it, the well-known tragedy of Gerald McClellan, which I think overshadows the fight itself, because it was a genuinely great fight, and it was a particularly brutal one while it lasted. McClellan got off to the near-perfect start, knocking Benn through the ropes, and almost finishing the fight in the opening minute. Benn also took an absolute pasting in the early rounds, having to walk down McClellan and soak up a ton of punishment to get his own shots off. The kind of heart, tenacity and will to win that Benn showed in that fight was honestly incredible. Since most super middleweights from that era would not have survived, they would not have made it through those early rounds due to Gerald's power and finishing instincts. Of course, after surviving the early onslaught, Nigel completely took over the fight and put a beating on Gerald, dropping him and forcing a stoppage, with Gerald sadly ending up disabled afterwards. But let's not pretend based on that it wasn't a great fight to watch, because it certainly was. Coming in at number 12 we have Arthur Abraham vs Robert Stieglitz 1, once again for the WBO super middleweight title. So as I mentioned before, Abraham vs Stieglitz was a very underrated rivalry, and in my opinion the first fight between them was even better than the third. Another example of a fight where you had two guys who had very good boxing ability, but were so evenly matched that the fight quickly descended into a brawl, and these guys seemed to dislike each other so much on a personal level and were desperate to smash each other's faces in. Seriously, watch all the Abraham Stieglitz fights one after the other. They fought 4 times, and every single fight was an absolute war. The first fight for me was the most entertaining of the 4. I actually had Stieglitz winning personally, but Abraham officially won by a close unanimous decision that could arguably have gone either way. Great fight to watch. Coming in at number 11 we have Juan Diaz vs Michael Katsidis for the IBO lightweight title. Here we have another absolute war from two fighters who refused to take a backward step. I mentioned earlier how Diaz was able to drag Marquez into a fight, knock him down and really force a performance out of him. Well, Katsidis was able to do the exact same thing against Marquez, just not to the same degree. Both of them dropped him and attempted to overwhelm him with pressure and power, and both got taken apart and taken out. Putting those guys together, given their fighting styles in retrospect, seems like perfect matchmaking to me. How could this fight have been anything other than an absolute war? And it didn't disappoint. What intrigues me about this fight too is how difficult it was to interpret, and how so many people's opinions on it seem to be mixed. Some people, including the HBO commentary team, thought it was a one-sided, dominant win for Diaz, whereas a lot of other people, including some of the crowd, actually thought Katsidis won. Officially, Diaz won by a close split decision, and this sparked a lot of debate online at the time, which people argue about to this day. As far as I saw the fight, I personally had Diaz winning in a close fight, so I thought the right man won, but I thought it was a far closer and more competitive fight than the commentators and a lot of the people who complained about the split decision afterwards thought. I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that you could have had Katsidis winning. It's one of them fights where it was really difficult to score. I know he did have a lot of facial damage that made it look like he was losing, but that doesn't always tell the full story. He landed a lot of shots of his own and made the fight competitive the whole way through, and it was a very entertaining one to watch. Coming in at number 10 we have Diego Corrales vs Jose Luis Castillo for the WBC and WBO lightweight title. Just making it into the top 10 we have another classic. The best way I can describe this fight is to say that it was a massacre. A rock'em sock'em robots type of fight between two absolute warriors who refused to give up. It was also one of the most famous and incredible comebacks in boxing history, with Corrales coming back from multiple hard knockdowns and a potentially career-ending beating to score a knockout victory against Castillo. Just an incredible fight to watch that I really can't do justice. Just go and watch it for yourself and tell me what you think. Coming in at number 9 we have Manny Pacquiao vs Juan Manuel Marquez 1 for the IBF featherweight title. Here we have the first in another epic rivalry, and this is a fight that wasn't without controversy, but nonetheless was an amazing fight to watch. Pacquiao came out in the first round and absolutely set about Marquez, knocking him down 3 times, putting an absolute beating on him, and coming close to forcing a first round stoppage. Marquez was able to make it through the round and adjusted his tactics a bit. What followed was a great back and forth fight, where both guys had their moments, and the second half was an absolute war. Despite coming back so well and winning several of the later rounds, Marquez didn't do nearly enough to overcome Pacquiao's massive lead from the early rounds, including the 3 knockdowns in round 1, with Pacquiao winning the fight clearly. However, in my opinion, what was an absolute robbery, the fight was officially scored a draw, which was particularly scandalous, particularly when you consider that one of the judges actually ignored one of Manny's knockdowns, which turned out to be the difference on that scorecard leading to the draw. Despite Pacquiao being robbed, it was still a fantastic fight to watch, and again, the start of an epic rivalry. Coming in at number 8, we have Alex Arthur versus Steve Foster Jr. for the WBO Super Featherweight title. This fight was actually quite similar to the Adamek Briggs fights, in the sense that Arthur was definitely the better fighter of the two, with the better boxing skills. He was also the bigger puncher, but the problem is that Arthur was badly weight drained at Super Featherweight, and Foster was an incredibly tough, durable and determined fighter who was much healthier at the weight, and it made for a highly competitive and fascinating fight, and one that I love rewatching. It's another example of a back and forth, high IQ brawl, where both men hit the canvas, and one that was fascinating to watch. Both men had their moments throughout, and for some reason I like this fight even more than some of the classics previously mentioned on this list. It's just one of them fights where you're on the edge of your seat the whole time, and you never know which way it's gonna go. Just when it looked like one of them was gonna completely take over and maybe force a stoppage, the other one would make a comeback and land something solid that would completely turn the fight around. Such a great fight. Coming in at number 7, we have Timothy Bradley versus Ruslan Provodnikov for the WBO welterweight title. This was another fight that can be described as a massacre, and another one that was rightfully named Fight of the Year after it happened. Bradley was coming off of a robbery win against Manny Pacquiao, which gained him a lot of backlash and basically made him one of the more disliked fighters in the sport for a while, since it was probably one of the most high-profile robberies in boxing history, and at that point in time it was big news. And going into his fight with Provodnikov, it seemed like Bradley had a point to prove. Despite Provodnikov being a dangerous puncher with a granite chin, Bradley, who ran all night against Pacquiao, took the fight to Provodnikov and made it an absolute war. Some would say this was foolish, and I'd agree to an extent, since it was a massive risk, but on a positive note, it made the fight an absolute classic. Bradley was dropped multiple times, once in the first round, however the ref controversially didn't count it, and took a knee in the closing seconds of the 12th. He was also out on his feet more than once, and came very close to being stopped. Yet despite this, he was able to hang in there and land plenty of shots of his own, winning several rounds on sheer effort and work rate, and he even stunned Provodnikov here and there, stopping him in his tracks. The fight went the distance, and Bradley won by a close unanimous decision. Personally, I thought the decision was fair, although it's controversial in the sense that the first round knockdown wasn't counted. It would have led to Provodnikov getting the win if it was, so it was controversial in that regard. Nonetheless, putting that aside, I thought it was a genuine and fair decision win for Bradley, and a great fight to watch back. Coming in at number 6, we have Alexander Povetkin versus Marco Huck for the WBA heavyweight title. Probably the most underrated fight of all time. This is one that I've talked about at length on the channel before, and for me it's one of the most fascinating fights to watch from a technical and stylistic point of view. And it's one that every time I watch it, and I mean every single time, I feel as if I learn something new from it. It's a fight I was hyped about back in the day, since I was quite a big fan of both men, and they both fought their absolute hearts out. Povetkin was steamrolling top 10 heavyweight contenders at the time, and then Huck came along, who was the number 1 cruiserweight at the time, and moved up to put on a career best performance, giving Povetkin the toughest fight of his career up until that point. Officially, Povetkin won by a close majority decision. Could have went either way in my opinion, but it is what it is. Coming in at number 5, we have Josh Taylor versus Regis Prograis for the WBA and IBF light welterweight title. As long-time subscribers of mine will know, this was my most anticipated fight of 2019, and I was absolutely hyped about it. Also, if you saw my prediction video right before it, link in description, then you will know that it was probably my best and most accurate prediction ever on this channel, since it's a fight that I did a lot of studying for and really looked into. As far as the fight itself, it was an absolute war, with two genuine world-class fighters at their prime, and I mean their absolute prime, putting it all on the line and giving it all they had. It was a back and forth war the whole way through, where both men had their moments, both took over in spots, but ultimately Taylor was able to prevail, winning by a close but clear majority decision, with his size, strength, power and stamina being the difference in the long run. He was also the more technically proficient on the inside and just knew how to create openings, making small adjustments as the fight went on. It's actually a fascinating fight to watch back, since it's another one where you might not notice things on a first watch, but there were a lot of subtleties to it. It's a shame that the fight seemed to take a lot out of both guys, since in my opinion neither one of them really improved much afterwards, and they declined pretty quickly, which is the same thing that happened to Berto and Ortiz, and Sturm and Gil. Sometimes these kinds of great fights that go back and forth the whole way just take so much out of both fighters, and they're never able to get back to that level afterwards. I think this is another example of that. But nonetheless, the fight itself is a great one, and I love rewatching it from time to time. Coming in at number 4, we have Manny Pacquiao vs Juan Manuel Marquez 2 for the WBC Super Featherweight title. What fascinates me about the second Pacquiao-Marquez fight is just how different it was from the first fight. The first fight was an absolute war, but I thought it was a pretty clear and conclusive win for Pacquiao, but not as competitive as a lot of people think it was. The second fight, on the other hand, is edge-of-your-seat stuff. Both guys had improved so much from the first fight, from a technical point of view, that it made the fight so much more difficult to interpret, and in my opinion it was much closer and more competitive than the first fight was, and it was much more entertaining as a result of that. Despite the technical improvements made by both men, there were still a lot of punches landed. Both were cut, both were hurt multiple times, and both went back and forth the whole way, and a lot of the rounds were difficult to score. Pacquiao scored a knockdown in round 3, and for me that was the difference on the scorecards. This was why I thought he won by 1 point. So for me it was a perfectly fair decision. I'd really recommend watching it, and it may require multiple watches to truly appreciate. I think it's the most entertaining fight of the quadrilogy. Coming in at number 3 we have Alexander Usyk vs Mairis Briedis for the WBO and WBC Cruiserweight title. Again, this is another fight that I've talked about many times on the channel, and it's honestly one of the greatest fights I've ever seen. I think it's so underrated. Usyk is a phenom in boxing, and he's been able to accomplish so much in just 23 fights that no other fighter has ever come close to achieving in boxing. And with all the amazing performances he's had in his career, and all the crazy upsets we've seen since, it's easy to forget that he hasn't always had it his own way. His Cruiserweight title reign was a particularly difficult one, with back-to-back high IQ wars against world-class fighters in their backyards, and without a doubt, the toughest fight he ever had in his career was the Briedis fight, and in my opinion it was the most entertaining one. When I use the term high IQ brawl, the Alexander Usyk vs Mairis Briedis fight is the very definition of that. A fight between two genuine elite fighters, pretty much in their prime, who both engaged in a chess match with each other, but due to how evenly matched they were, it descended into a crazy scrap, and one that for me is one of the greatest fights in the history of boxing, and one that I genuinely can't recommend enough. It was actually this fight that convinced me that Usyk had the chin, the stamina and the IQ to make a serious impact on the heavyweight division, which he of course went on to do. Coming in at number 2 we have Marco Antonio Barrera vs Erik Morales 1. I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody about this fight. It's generally regarded as one of the greatest fights of all time, and I happen to agree, as it stands alone as an example of a fight that kicked off one of the fiercest and most legendary rivalries in boxing history. As I mentioned before, these two absolutely despised one another and just wanted to smack each other repeatedly every time they were in each other's presence. They couldn't even get through a press conference without coming to blows, and the fights between them were all epic, but none of them had anything on the first fight. I almost don't know how I could possibly describe it and do it justice. It's just one of them fights that you have to watch for yourself for you to truly appreciate it. Two absolute warriors who were desperate to come out on top, but who also had, in my opinion, elite level boxing skills and a very similar fighting style. One of the greatest fights in the history of boxing in my personal opinion. Go and watch it if you want to know why. Finally, coming in at number 1, we have my personal favourite fight of all time, and in my personal opinion, the greatest fight in boxing history. Thomas Adamek versus Steve Cunningham. The first fight for the IBF Cruiserweight title. Again, I've talked about this fight so many times on the channel, and for me it's absolutely incredible. A fight between two world-class cruiserweights, neither of which wanted to give any ground at all, who just beat the absolute crap out of each other for 12 rounds. Adamek scored 3 knockdowns in the fight, in between taking a beating, and both guys landed some absolute bombs throughout. There wasn't a single round of this fight that wasn't back and forth, and wasn't action-packed. And for me, all the back and forth wars that I've seen in boxing, this one, ever since I first saw it, has always stood out to me. The amount of heart, durability and will to win that both of these guys showed was genuinely unbelievable. Genuinely the greatest fight I've ever seen. So yeah, those are my top 50 favourite fights of all time. This was kind of a last minute thrown together video that I decided to make just to keep the channel going until my next major project. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, leave me your list in the comment section and let me know of some fights that I may have missed that you think I might enjoy. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching and God bless.